Start. Let's start with the ice cream.
Yeah.
Cut the food.
People are such a good man.
That's true. Okay, let's just start.
Yeah.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Hack School 2. We're just gonna start with the icebreaker and we'll get to food later. So icebreaker time. If you could be any supernatural being, which one would it be? So go ahead and discuss in your pods. Just leave them to that for a bit.
Like, yeah, 5 minutes. Oh, I appreciate that. My napkins from the
I think they're going, I don't know what Nathan's doing.
fine. Always on the search.
I know. Yeah.
It depends on.
Okay, so does anyone want to explain what supernatural being they would be? Anyone? I'm gonna call on a random pod. Okay? Okay, you guys over there. Yeah.
I chose the Christian God, just omnipresent.
Oh, okay.
You know,
Okay, supernatural. All right. Okay, sounds good. So here's, if you guys don't have access to the slides or repo yet, here are the URL links. And then did you send it on Discord?
The slide?
Yeah.
I'm gonna do that right now.
We're gonna send it over to Discord also.
That's awkward.
Okay, it's on the announcements in Discord if you guys need access still. But before we begin, if you haven't already, just to set up for our activities for this workshop, just follow these steps. And then if you guys need help, we'll be walking around. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. And if you guys are still having issues with getting the activities, people are gonna be like walking around to help. But okay, so far we've gone over HTML and CSS, and then today we're going to be going over JavaScript. So first we're going to go over the intro and then basic syntax for JavaScript. And starting off, we're going to be going over the differences between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So as we discussed in the last workshop, HTML is basically the skeleton of your website or application. And CSS is how you're going to style it and make it more appealing to the eye. And then JavaScript will be how you add interactivity to it and kind of connect it to the database and functionality. Okay, just to start off, we're going to go off like the syntax. And I think you guys probably went over variables in class. But for JavaScript, it has its own type of way to declare them. And for this, we use let for declaring variables that can change in value. And then for constants that we don't want them to be able to change, we declare it with const. And var is one of the older ways to define it, but we're not going to be ever using that unless you have a version older than, I think it was like, well, an older version of JS. So it's not going to be necessary. And then here are like a few of the types of data types that we have in JavaScript. The ones that we're going to be mainly using are the ones that you guys will be probably familiar with already, which is numbers, strings, booleans, and if you guys have gone over arrays, which is like basically a collection of elements, and also objects, which we'll be going over during this workshop. And just to get started, for debugging using JavaScript, we usually use console.log. And this allows us to output like different like strings or variables that we want to be able to see from our log. So in this example, we do console.log and then parentheses, welcome to Hack School. And then on our console log, it puts out welcome to Hack School. And you can do this for variables also. As you see here for the week number, we declare our number to be 2. And we console log we are on week and then the week number variable. And it prints out we are on week 2. And you guys will be using this during your activities. So if you ever need to just go back and see that, it's here. And another interesting part with Java is that it has kind of 2 ways of checking equality. And one of these ways is through just like through the value. So here we see that this 5 is like, its data type is a number. And then we're setting it equal to, or not setting it to equal, but we're checking for equality using a double equal sign and towards a string 5, which you could tell is a string because of the quotations. So if you do this on your console log, it's going to show that they're equal, even though the data types are different. But then if you use the triple equal sign, it's going to show that it's false because they have different data types. And in general, we want to be using the triple equality signs because this just keeps your code more consistent because you're not always going to know what it's doing between these. And then following this, we're going to go over if statements. And so I'm not sure if you guys have gone over this during like your courses yet already, but this is just like the basic way to declare if statements in JavaScript. And here we're going to be testing if x is greater than 0, having x already equal 1. So the console log will print x is a positive number if it is greater than 0, which will be what will be printed here. And then if x was like -1, say, then it would print x is negative a number and then so on. And then we'll be using null values and undefined inside of our activities. So I wanted to go over that quickly. But we have truthy and falsy statements. When we are doing x, if x here and x is equal to null, it's going to say that it's going to return false. And then all other values will be true. And then just some basic coding habits to have with JavaScript is to include a semicolon, even though JavaScript doesn't explicitly need you to have semicolons to end your statements. It's still a good habit just to make sure your code is like readable and clear. And also on that note, make sure to use comments. And these are 2 ways you can do it, which is through single line comments and then also multi-line comments. Okay, so going back to kind of how JavaScript views like different data types, I want you guys to like kind of guess or like discuss inside your pods what you think all of these will be equal to. And you guys are free to discuss, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you mean now?
Good. I love people that have answers.
Are you supposed to know the answer?
Yeah, I'll just ask them. Okay, let's gather together our thoughts. Okay, so for the first one, does anyone want to give a shot at it? For 2 plus 2, what would that equal? Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's 4.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, good job, good job. Okay, so the strings 2 plus 2, does anyone want to guess what that would equal? Mhm. That, do you remember what those? Okay. Okay. Huh? What'd you say? Yeah, it's 22 because you're basically concatenating the 2 plus the 2. And that would be 22. Yeah. Okay. Oh, whoops. Well, pretend you didn't see that. But 2 plus 2 minus 2, what do you guys think would equal? Going off like the same one as 2 plus 2. Okay, I'm seeing a 2 sign. Okay, yes. Okay, and for the last one?
20.
Yes. Very nice, very nice. Yeah. And that one is just kind of just weird. I'm not. What?
The stream will pop to ask the two of them.
That is just so odd. Do you want to explain that? Do you think it's necessary? I think it's fine. Okay. So let's just start with our first activity. And you guys will basically filling out the function log trips inside the Hack School 2 repo and give information about a trip that we're planning. And we want to output a message detailing the trip's name and its associated costs. And if you guys still need help setting up the part 2 activity, just we'll be walking around.
Okay, guys. All right, guys. Test. Is it working?
Yes,
Okay. All right, guys, I think we can wrap up exercise 1 for now. Guys. So we'll go do a brief rundown and a tutorial on how to run your files. So, all right, thanks. So, oh, it's already done.
What? Okay, just go.
Okay. So for this function, we've already filled in the template, and all we need to do is add stuff into the body. And our goal here is to log out our trip name, our length of the trip, and the cost per day. And we can just do that with 3 console.log statements, or 1 if you prefer, it doesn't really matter. So all you have to do is just type in console.log. And what do we want to pass in? Well, we have in 3 parameters inside our function, and we can just log each one individually. Oh, sorry, yeah. So we can say our trip name is, and then we can pass in trip name. What this does is it'll print out our trip name is, followed with a space and this variable, whatever is contained inside trip name. And then we can follow this up with another console.log statement saying we are staying for trip length days. And then finally, we can just say something along the lines of it cost per day. To run this file and the code, all you have to do is look for this little triangle in the top right corner. I'm like circling it with my cursor and click it. And then a bunch of stuff ran, but if we scroll, we can see our code output over here. If anyone has trouble running this file, it's probably because you don't have Node installed, so raise your hand and someone can help you out. But hopefully the code ran for all you guys. Cool.
Okay, so we're gonna get started with the objects in JavaScript, and I'll just explain what those are and like why we use them. So objects are used for kind of organizing and grouping data in a way that's like more readable and easier to use by the coder. And so first, to create and use objects, we have to first make the object or name the object. And for this case, we name it organization and we define it as a constant. So it's not going to be changeable. And then here inside the curly brackets are the properties of this object. So you can see here that we have the name, ACM, UCSD, and then how old the organization is, which is 6 years. And we have Hack School here as another property that outputs JavaScript workshop in the console. And then here's how we can access these objects. So we can make a variable called my name and set it equal to the organization's name using the dot. And if we do console.log, this will output ACM UCSD. And the same will occur if we use brackets. And I'll discuss the differences between using the dot and the bracket in the next slide. But yeah, and then for here, this is kind of how you'd use it as a function for Hack School, which will print out JavaScript workshops in your console. And so, okay. So to modify objects, there's 2 different ways that you can do this, which is using the dot. And then also the other way, which is using the brackets. The reason you would want to use the brackets over the dot is if you're trying to access a property that has special characters inside the property's name. So you can see here for Hack School, the participant count, which is misspelled, I think, but participant count, well, you need to use the brackets because of the space in between participant and count. And then you can also set this to a different value if you'd want, using Hack School participant count and then setting it equal to 90. And if you use console log, Hack School brackets participant count, it will then output 90. And then another reason you'd want to use brackets is if you want to access the like a dynamic variable using that. And here you use constant property name, and we set that equal to the host. And we output person property name, and this would output all of the hosts that are currently hosting the Hack School. Okay, so that was like a quick overview of the objects, but you'll get some practice into this in our next activity, which is in the file. And we've created a trip object, and we want you to basically kind of change the values of the tripped object in the file. And yeah. Okay, we're gonna just wrap up this activity and I'll just go and show you guys how you would go about changing this. And okay, well, pretend you didn't see that. Okay, so for this part, we're just going to edit the trip length And we could use either a dot property or dot or. And we'll just change that to 3. And then we could change the cost per day using brackets. Then, let me see what name I should. Oh, well, I guess it doesn't matter. Let's just change that to 360. And you'd follow the same premise for just editing anything inside an object, either a dot or brackets. And then if I run this, there's a lot of stuff happening there. Okay. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Well, I was actually editing the solutions file, but and that didn't happen. Okay, so trip object. And then we could just reprint this and remember your semicolons because that's good habit. We're just going to print the object again to see the output. Let me see this. Really? What'd you say? What? This? Okay, and then you can see that it changes the object to set the trip length to 3 and the cost per day to 360. Okay. So moving on to loops, arrays, and functions.
All right, guys. So for this section, it's probably going to be review for a lot of you guys because these are like the bread and butter of all programming languages. But we'll just review the JavaScript syntax for all this. So starting off with while loops, it's defined with the keyword while and a parenthesis which has a condition. And how it works is everything inside those curly brackets gets repeated over and over and over again until that condition in the parenthesis is met. So let's take a look at this example here. We have a variable x set to 0. And we want to make sure that it's strictly less than 5. And every time it is, we will output it to the console and increment it by 1. So for this example, we would print out 0, 1, all the way to 4. And then when x is equal to 4, it's logged and it gets increased to 5. But since 5 is not less than 5, this while loop will terminate. One thing to make sure when you guys are writing these while loops is to make sure that your loop will definitely terminate, or else you will encounter some runtime errors due to infinite loops. These while loops are good when you have a condition that you don't know how many times will iterate. So for example, things like reading the file, you could do a while loop for a while there's still text left in the file to take in as input. A for loop is a while loop, but with extra steps. It's defined with the for keyword and a parenthesis with 3 expressions in it, separated by semicolons. And this time, these semicolons are necessary, even though we're in JavaScript. The first one, let I equal 0, does a bunch of initializing. It defines all your variables you want. So here we want to iterate through a variable called I. Our second one is the condition. That's very similar to the one we had in the while loop. This time we want I to be strictly less than 4. the third expression is what we do after the loop has finished, every iteration. So after every iteration has finished, we increment I by 1. And then through this example here, we can see it prints 0, 1, 2, 3. I think for the sake of time, sorry, we have too much slide. Now we're going to talk about arrays. Arrays we can just think of as a collection of data. And arrays can contain a multitude of variables. They can even be different types. So for example, we have an empty array, an array of numbers, array of strings, and an array containing numbers, strings, Boolean, and decimals. When we loop through an arrays, we use a bracket notation, and note that when counting through arrays, the first element is not actually index 1, it's index 0. This is called zero-based indexing. Additionally, make sure you don't index outside of an array. So if you look at our example, our array has a size of 3 because there are 3 elements. So the first element would correspond to array 0, then array 1, then array 2. So even though the size is 3, the last element will have an index of 2. If you try to access out of bounds, you will get the value undefined. For this for loop, we can actually use the array.length property to see how long an array is, regardless if we know how long it is or not. So instead of doing I is less than 3, we just do I is less than array.length, and it will always iterate through the entire thing. One more possible loop that is a little different from the for loop is the for each loop. The for loop, the one we saw previously, it will loop a certain amount of times. But for the for each loop, it's very useful when we have things like objects or arrays, and we want to enumerate through every single property exactly once. This one is a really simple syntax. You just do a for your variable name of and the variable that you're iterating through. So here we have an array of colleges that are all strings, and we can just do for I of colleges and log out I. So each I will correspond to every element in the array, and it will go through from Ravel, Muir, Marshall, etc., etc. Also, we can think of strings as a collection of characters. So if we do that for each loop on the string ACM UCSD, it will print out every single character individually, ACM space UCSD. So functions are really, really important in all programming languages, and here's how we write them in JavaScript. We define them with the function keyword, followed by the name of our function, followed by a parenthesis. And inside, we specify what kind of parameters we want to pass into our function. This can range from nothing, so just an empty parenthesis, to as many arguments as you want. But it's generally good practice to not have too many arguments for the sake of making your code more readable. And then inside the curly brackets, we have the body of our function. It's just the logic that we want to do. And then we have a return statement. So functions, they can do stuff, but they also should output a value. And if we don't specify it, it will output undefined. So for example, if we're adding 2 numbers, we should return the summed value, from the stuff like that. And here is an example of a function. Let's go back to our previous example where we made an array of strings containing all the colleges of UCSD. And we make a function called getColleges, and we pass it in as a parameter. Note that the parameter name is actually different. Colleges list is not the same as colleges UCSD. That's just a placeholder name. We can pass in whatever we want inside that. And we put a little initialize a variable size, set it to 0, and iterate through the array. We output every single element inside, and every time we encounter an element, we increase the size count by 1. Hopefully that makes sense for everybody. And this should be the output. So we output every single college, and then our function returned the size. And then when we called const num colleges equals get colleges, the console.log statements ran, and the value 8 was assigned to the variable num colleges. When we output num colleges, we get that value 8 in the console as well. All right, cool. Yeah, for this activity, I think for the sake of time, I'll just run through it by you guys real quick. Should be chill. So let's get started. So we're going to make a function where we have 2 different trips, and all of them are in different places. They go on for different amounts of time, and they cost certain amounts of money, and we might have different amount of friends coming with us. So we want to find the trip that has the cheapest individual cost and return that trip. So let's do that. Let's go over here. Let's close that terminal for now. So here we've already created two trip objects for you. The first one is Christmas in Korea, has these values. Same one is Christmas in Taiwan. And then we made a commented outline where you can test your function cheaper trip. So let's go make that function right now. We define our function by using the function keyword right here and give it a name. This time it'll be cheaper trip. We use the parenthesis to specify what kind of parameters we want to pass in. And here we want to pass in two different trips represented by trip object 1 and trip object 2. So for the placeholder name, I'll just call it trip 1, trip 2. Now we're inside the body of our function. This is where all the logic is going to take place. So let's make two variables, and these will be our calculated values, and we can compare them and return the trip that is cheaper. So let's make a variable called trip1 cost. So if we look back to our Google Slides, this is the formula to calculate the individual cost. We need the length times cost per day divided by number of travelers. So we can do that by looking at trip 1, trip object 1, looking at its length. We use the asterisk to multiply two numbers. We can multiply that by the cost per day. Division in JavaScript is used with a slash. And we want to divide by the number of travelers. By the way, I'm typing this so fast because I'm typing enter every time the auto suggest comes up. It's a useful hack. So now we have the individual cost for trip 1, and we can just do the exact same logic for trip 2. I'll just replace everything here with a 2.
Never actually put trip object, put trip 1 and trip 2.
Oh, my bad. Thank you. So now we have two of our calculated values, and we need to compare them. So we can do that with an if statement that we used before. So we can just say, if trip 1 cost is greater than the trip 2 cost, that means that trip 2 is cheaper. So we should return trip 2. And then we can do an else statement that catches everything, every other case, and return trip 1. There is one special case where if the two trips are equal cost, but it doesn't really matter in the context of this function. Does this make sense to everyone? Are there any questions? I'll run this code for you guys. And to make it more clear, so here it returned a Christmas in Taiwan, but we can replace the return values with the actual cost to make it more clear to you guys. And the individual cost was $316. Cool. So arrow functions are more specific to JavaScript, and this is pretty important. It's a more concise way to write a function compared to the previous method. And you'll be seeing this a lot more, especially in next week's React workshop. So here's how they differ from a normal function. Here, for the arrow function, we directly assign it to a variable. And in the bottom example, we have an arrow function called add nums. You first start off with parentheses, which is similar to the function parameters. It can be 0, so it would just be an empty parenthesis, or you could add as many as you want. And then to specify that as an arrow function, you would use equals greater equals greater than, and that makes a little arrow. And then after that, you add in the expression you want to return. So here we would immediately return whatever the parameters were, num1, num2, summed up together. So if we log out, add nums 5, 9, it would print out 14. If you wanted to have a more complex function with a lot of logic, instead of directly returning an expression after the arrow, you would add a curly brace, do whatever code you want, and add a return value at the end, similar to how we did it in the previous code example. Does this make sense to everybody? Okay. So for this activity, instead of writing a normal function, I want you guys to write an arrow function. You guys will have an array of destinations, return true if our target destination is inside, and false otherwise. Feel free to get started. All right, guys, we're gonna get started on the implementation for this exercise. So I'm going to comment out this function so it doesn't pop up in our terminal. And then let's go on to this exercise over here. So we have an array of strings, and these strings represent our travel destinations. And we have a target destination that's left empty for here, but let's enter in some destination that is inside. Let's do Taipei. To make our function, we need to declare a variable and assign an arrow function to it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's make a function, let's make it a const, and let's call it is trip included. And what do we set it equal to? If you remember from our slide earlier, we need to add in the parenthesis, which represents all of the parameters this function takes. And the parameter will take two parameters. I mean, this function will take two parameters, one being the destinations array and one being our target destination. So let's do that here. Arrow functions, they have the unique syntax equals greater than to represent the arrow. And since we don't want to immediately return and we want to actually add some code logic into our arrow function, let's use a curly brace over here. And inside this curly brace is where we'll do all of our logic. So to do this, we should probably do something like along the lines of iterating through the entire destination and comparing every single element with our target and seeing if they're equal to each other. So let's go ahead and do that. It seems that the for each loop would probably be our best bet here, since we do want to loop through every single element in this array. So we can just do that. We can say for, call our iterated variable destination of destinations. And we should compare each destination with our target one. So let's do that with an if statement. If destination. And it's good practice to use triple equal sign because sometimes we might have the same value, but they might be different types, which is bad practice. So we use if destination equals our target destination, we can return true. Otherwise, where should I add the return false? Should I add it here or on the bottom? We should add it on the bottom because sometimes if we can't find our destination, we will immediately exit even if our target destination is later down the array. So we want to exit this function after we completed our loop to ensure that we truly haven't found anything. And then let's run our code. And we can see true. And now let's try a different case. Let's try the case, I don't know, Honolulu. Hopefully that's not inside. That is not inside. Save our file, run it, and we can see that this time it's false. Do we have any questions about arrow functions or their syntax? Cool. If you guys have any questions, just feel free to raise your hands and ask. But for now, we can move on to. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Oh, this is the true sign.
So if we have two variables that have the same value. For example, the number 5 and the string 5 with the quotation marks, double equal sign would return true, that they are equal to each other. But triple equal sign would not, because one's a number and one's a string, even though they have the same value inside them. Anyone else? Cool, cool. All right, let's get started. All right, this section is pretty complicated for JavaScript, but we'll take it slowly. And this is kind of review for Hack School 4. So we will come back to it later for sure. So let's start off with asynchronous code. So synchronous code is probably how you would imagine coding. We go line by line in a linear fashion and execute code one line at a time. But sometimes we do very long, complex operations, maybe something like a network call, or we're reading from a database. And these things can take several seconds maybe. And it's impractical to wait for this operation to finish and resume with your line of code. And sometimes JavaScript will just continue on even if the thing hasn't finished and you have an empty variable because the operation hasn't completed yet. This is where asynchronous code comes in, where we can do a long, complex operation, wait for it to return a result, but in the meantime, do other things that our program wants to do. So that's just kind of like the concept behind asynchronous programming, and it'll come in handy for later. So how do we actually do that though? And one way to do this is with a callback function. So if you remember earlier, we can pass in parameters to any kind of function, right? We can pass in no parameters, we can pass in numbers, objects, arrays, strings, but we can also pass in other functions themselves. And when you do that, that's called a callback function. This is because when we do long, complex operations, after that thing has completed, maybe we have something else we want to do. And that logic can be implemented inside the callback function. It's basically saying, once you're done, call me, and I will do my thing. So in this basic example, we have a greet function where the first line of code is to say hello name, and then it will call a function called callback. Inside this callback function, we have yet another console.log, call me back. And we can see in the output that the top console.log inside greet ran first and then call me back because it executed after everything else was completed. In real types of code, this console.log will be replaced with like network operations, and then we will be handling those network operations and doing things with them, for example. Cool. A promise is it's a type of object that we'll deal with a lot in asynchronous code. And sometimes when we do an operation, it might not necessarily succeed. Let's say we had a timeout or a network error, or there's some error on the user's end. We need to have a way to send an error message back to the user that this was not successful. And vice versa, we need to have data sent back when the operation is successful. That's where a promise comes in. It's an object where we have two states, a resolve, aka the success state, and a reject, the fail state. So when we resolve, we can probably assume things like the data has been given back to the user. And when we have a fail state, we will try to log out an error so the user can know what went wrong. And in this example, we have like a family guy, and the promise is that he promises to clean his room. And if the promise returns a success, he's allowed to go play. Otherwise, he needs to do his laundry. So here's a little code snippet that actually handles this, and we'll break this line by line. So when we resolve with a promise, that means that we have successfully completed our operation. We can chain it. Chaining means to add on to, at the very end of the line of code, a .then statement. This statement will trigger once the success happens, and we can add whatever we want inside the .then. Similarly, we have a .catch for errors. So if the operation failed, everything in between the promise and the .catch would get skipped. So we skip right to the .catch, and we reject the error. So let's take a look at this code snippet. We made a new promise, and inside it has a function. And we do something called axios.get, which is just a library we use to fetch data. You don't actually need to know it. but it's just a placeholder thing for a network operation in this example. Let's assume that the axios.get is successful. The .then statement would be triggered, and then it takes in an arrow function. The response would be whatever the data is sent back from our .get operation, and then we resolve it by passing in that data. Otherwise, we would get sent an error, maybe something like a timeout error 404, and then we can reject it and pass in that error into the reject. We can also do, we can call this variable and then add a .then to it and log out either the response, the success message, or the error message. Sorry, that was a handful, but any questions? Promises themselves, we won't be touching that much in hack school, but it's just a nice concept to understand when we're dealing with asynchronous code. Okay, cool. So how do we actually write asynchronous code? We use the async keyword in front of a function to indicate that it's asynchronous. And async functions by themselves are the exact same, but they have one specialty is that you can add in the keyword await inside the body. So what happens with this await is everything after the await statement the function will pause everything inside until that value comes in, and then it will continue on. So in this example, we have a promise and we assigned it to the result. We assigned it to the variable result. And this promise is just a function that takes 4 seconds. That's what the set timeout does. It takes 4 seconds to run and it resolves, AKA has a success. So what happened in this code is that we will console.log the result. And what should happen is it'll take 4 seconds and then promise resolved will pop up in the console. And we have just a console.log hello for good measure. Cool, cool. So for this activity, we've made a sample function for you that deals fetch exchange rate that simulates a network call and gets back exchange rate for a bunch of currencies. So you guys should make a function called get exchange rate, which which takes in a currency, sees if their exchange rate exists, and if so, you guys should log it or just do something cool with it. Otherwise, add an error message and say we couldn't find the exchange rate. Cool. Feel free to get started and ask questions if you guys get stuck. Sounds good.
Okay, before we go over the activity solutions, just everyone discuss in your pods, like if you have any questions, and then like kind of just ask them here. Find where you were.
Oh. You want me to-
That's so
No, I'm here, bro. I'm here.
Yeah, but we're just having them, if they have questions, just ask as a group type of thing.
All right. All right, guys, it's almost time, so we'll wrap up this exercise and call it a day. All right, guys, let's wrap this up. Wrap up the combos, please. We're almost done. Finally, I know. Okay. Let's get started. Let's comment this out. So we've already made a test function. Hey guys, quiet down, all right? Thank you. So here's our sample function that we made for you. And this will simulate a network call. And the reason why that is we have a little set timeout. And what this means is that all the code inside the set timeout will take 1500 milliseconds to complete. And that means we can use this to as an await in our asynchronous function. So let's get started with that. The instructions say we want to make an async function, fetch exchange rate. And the syntax for that is to mark the function as async function fetch exchange rate. The purpose of these functions is because we want to see if a currency can be converted to a different type of currency. So our fetch exchange rate will need to take 2 currencies as input. Let's call that currency 1 and currency 2. So in order to do this, we want to call this function and see what it says for us. Because if the currency exists, we will get this resolve statement saying that the currency exchange is whatever it is. Otherwise, this reject statement will trigger and say the currency does not exist. So let's go ahead and do that. We can call this function await get exchange rate, plug in the currencies, currency 1, currency 2, and assign that value into a variable. Let's just call it results. So what will happen is that this function will get called. The entire function fetch exchange rate will pause until this value is this operation is completed and this result has a value. We can then do some code very similar to the code in the slides here. But on the bottom, we have promise.then, but instead of promise, we'll just be calling it result. The .then will trigger if our get exchange function resolves, and the .catch will trigger if it rejects. So we can do that right here. We can do result.then. .then takes in an arrow function, so we can do that right here. We have a parenthesis for our parameters, and inside we're going to say, let's just call it success message. A success message will be passed down from our get exchange rate function. We can mark it as an arrow function with the equal sign, greater than sign. And then we can just console.log the success message. We can do a .catch after to handle all the error message. So let's just call it error message and exact same thing. Mark as an arrow function and console.log the error message. So let's try it out. Let's first try it out with our USD to euros conversion. Why is it not working? Okay, so I forgot to add in the curly brace over here. Then it should be good. I'm missing do you see the parentheses I'm missing?
To close this one.
Oh, I see. Yeah. There we go. Where's the dot then not triggering?
You don't need to wait.
Yeah, okay. We had an await statement that was unnecessary, and then if we plugged in the dot, then it works now, saying that the USD to euros works. Yeah, sorry about that. So next up, we can try the error message where we have USD to some other currency, and that doesn't exist inside our conversion rates. And then we can see that the exchange rate was not found. Okay, cool. That wraps up the exercises. We should have a feedback form for everyone. Oh,
Just go to next one. Go press that. Right there.
right. On the way out, can you scan this feedback form, by the way? Yeah, can you scan this feedback form on the way out, by the way? Cool.
Please, just for the feedback, so we can make the workshop better for next time, please. Please fill out the QR code.